This is Season 2 of the MENA Talks podcast. The MENA Talks is a series by the BIC on the wider Middle East and Africa regions. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will have a frank discussion on underlying historical, economic, social, and political drivers behind today's systemic issues. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Welcome to Season 2 of the MENA Talks podcast. My name is Ben Lowings. I'm a political analyst at the BIC. I'm pleased today to be joined by William Davison, who is a senior analyst for Ethiopia at the International Crisis Group. Ethiopia is the second largest African country by population after Nigeria, but it's currently experiencing a period of prolonged civil strife. The violence in northern Tigray region that began in November 2020 between Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government forces and those of the Tigray People's Liberation Front has caused, according to researchers at Ghent University, an estimated 500,000 deaths due to violence, famine, or lack of medical attention. One of the most notable aspects of this tragedy has been a dimension both rhetorical and literal, that of ethnic violence, with accusations on both sides of targeted violence, massacres, and other atrocities between Tigrayan and Amharan militias. But it is not only Tigray where such violence has occurred. On 18th of June of this year, more than 100 people, mostly of Amharan ethnic origin, were massacred within the Oromia region. Official blame was directed towards the Oromo Liberation Army, yet another active rebel militia within the country. On this note, we can begin the discussion. William, if it's all possible to condense such complexity, why are these killings happening and moreover, seemingly increasing in their frequency?
Thanks. I think as your introduction explained, this is a sort of multifaceted crisis in Ethiopia. The violence centered around Tigray was essentially between political dispute between the federal government and Tigray's government, and that led to a civil war between those two entities, but with allied forces joining in on the federal side. So the Eritrean military from the country to the north of Ethiopia and of Tigray, but also prominently from Amhara region as well. So that had a sort of particular character to it. And then this violence in Oromia is of a slightly different nature. It revolves around some of the same themes related to questions of identity and its role in politics and state structures, and also sort of degrees of autonomy for regional states vis-a-vis the federal government. But what we have in Oromia is more of an insurgency from the Oromo Liberation Army, the OLA, and then a counter-insurgency operation by the federal military and regional security forces in Oromia region. So that's sort of a slightly different character to the clash between this sort of dissident regional state, Tigray, and the authorities there and the federal government. But as you can imagine, there's also plenty of other sort of deeper explanations for the type of violence that we're seeing.
So on that point where you mentioned the deeper explanations, is there, in countries such as Ethiopia where there are protracted conflicts, protracted civil strife, there's normally a history of grievances between groups, between populations, between communities. What would you say are the central grievances that are being displayed at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the first things to mention, obviously, is that although Ethiopia has seen a certain amount of growth and economic growth and infrastructural development, improvement in socioeconomic indicators over the last decade or so, it's still a very poor and underdeveloped country relatively. It also has a growing population, so 3% a year. So that creates a lot of stress. There's very low paying jobs. There's lots of underemployment, employment, and unemployment. There's climatic stresses from droughts and associated economic problems, high inflation, which makes obviously the cost of living shoot up, so leads to plenty of frustration. The types of dynamics that fuel political instability and violence everywhere. So all of those things are present. Of course, the extent to which they're drivers or a symptom of the core political problems is something else to be debated. And then with regards to those sort of deeper political problems, Ethiopia is a very diverse country in terms of its the identity of the population, whether you describe them as nations, as they like to be described, the ethno-nationalists, or whether you describe them as ethnicities or tribes or whatever. It's a diverse nation. There's many different languages and etc. In a process of nation and state building that really began to gather pace in the late 19th century and through the 20th century, as in many other places, there was also a degree of homogenization. It was also repressive and discriminatory in terms of some groups being dominant over others, some religions, notably Orthodox Christianity, and languages, notably the Amharic language, becoming dominant over these multiple other identities that existed in Ethiopia. That was all came under the umbrella broadly of an imperial system, various emperors, I guess most commonly known Emperor Haile Selassie, whose reign was interrupted by the Second World War and being deposed by Mussolini's fascists, but otherwise had a long reign of decades in the middle of the 20th century. But that all came to an end with the Popular Revolution in 1974, led essentially to a communist dictatorship or Marxist dictatorship, a military regime. Now, both those systems, whether it's the imperial system or the military regime that followed, they significantly repressed, held back, homogenized, assimilated these different ethnic or ethno-linguistic identities. From the late 60s into the 70s, there was an explosion of ethno-national consciousness, a lot of it along sort of Marxist lines. It was similar thinking to as we saw in the Soviet Union with the concept of a multinational nation or the concept of nationalities. And to cut a long story short, in the 1990s, there was another regime change, and the rebellions that forced that were mostly ethno-nationalist in nature, whether Eritrean, Tigrayan, Oromo, Somali, Sidama, etc. Eritrea formed a nation state out of this, so seceded from Ethiopia. The rest of the Ethiopian identity-based political communities essentially came together and formed a multinational federation, often known as an ethnic federation, formally constituted in 1995. Now that divided the country up into semi-autonomous regions with a strong ethno-national, ethno-linguistic character to them. So the idea was a power-sharing arrangement where everyone's kind of cultural and linguistic and political rights were respected. And to some degree that worked, but the system had its proponents and opponents, and it's always been heavily contested. And I think the contestation over that system, whether it's the power sharing or just the structure and nature of it, with ethnicity or identity having such a prominent role in politics and state structures and federal politics, that has increasingly been challenged in the last few years. And really it's the disputes between those ethno-nationalist forces who say that autonomy and respect for self-determination, etc., are non-negotiable, and those who say that that type of political posture is leading to increasing segregation and division between Ethiopian peoples, and want a more united structure, and they want political moves towards fostering and strengthening an Ethiopian identity vis-a-vis sub-national identities. It's that kind of competition. We can present it in binary terms in that sense. It's that competition which is at the heart of these political disputes.
Okay, on that point about this existing system of ethnic federalism, I guess, which is what's been termed as, you mentioned that about Ethiopia being separated on ethno-national lines into what they term in the constitution as nations.
Actually, nations, nationalities, or peoples.
Right, exactly.
They're not precisely defined in the constitution, right. I think is the point.
Right, but it also, interestingly, despite that aspect of ambiguity, the constitution also gives each so-called nation the unconditional right to self-determination, including a specific right to secession. Now, we've seen a couple of times that there's been some disputed polls in regions where people have voted on this issue, and as of yet, the country is still together. Now, my question to you is, do you think that these conditions within the constitution have actually created an undercurrent of instability and exacerbated this type of division or not?
I think it's a factor. I'm not quite sure what you're referring to in terms of those votes. We've had a couple of processes where communities there's been political processes for new regions to be formed. That's also constitutional right. So a sort of upgrading of administrative status for some of these communities. So it does create sort of churn and dynamism within the federal system. There's always the potential for a group to argue for their constitutional right to self-determination up until secession. So I think it's I think by definition, it creates a certain amount of instability because that right to self-determination is protected by the constitution. To answer the question in any more profound sense, you have to go back to sort of why the federation was formed, essentially, because it's like many things, it's a trade-off. The argument from ethno-nationalist groups, including very much from the TPLF, Tigray's ruling party, which whose government and forces are have been at war with the federal government. Their argument was that the only way to hold Ethiopia together in the 1990s, after sort of centuries of marginalization, discrimination, etc., was by allowing groups or regions the right to secede should the Ethiopian state become excessively repressive in their eyes. So that was the thinking behind it. I think it certainly does create some sort of like undercurrent of instability. I mean, generally, I think the way the political system was run over the last couple of decades, a very kind of authoritarian ruling party, which instilled a lot of discipline across the country, sort of de facto centralization, despite the sort of de jure rights to autonomy and decentralization. The prospect of secession was not really on the cards ever since Eritrea voted in the 1990s. That was before the constitution was formally enacted. Now we have the situation as a result of this civil war and the perception of genocide, even by Tigray's leaders and people. Now there's a lot of secessionist sentiment building in Tigray. So yes, essentially, there is that undercurrent of instability, and I think by definition, these rights to self-determination create instability. But it's only at times of great political disagreement, as we're seeing now, that the prospect of secession actually becomes a prominent one.
The conflict in Tigray officially started on 4th of November 2020, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed ordered military action against regional armed forces in Tigray, supported by the main Tigrayan political faction, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. However, the dispute between the TPLF and Prime Minister Abiy can be traced further back. The TPLF was a key part of a four-party coalition of ethnically based parties that ruled Ethiopia following the fall of the military junta in 1991. It was heavily relevant to the development of the Ethiopian federal system that emerged in 1994. This four-party system gave power and autonomy to certain regions, but was regularly criticised for being politically repressive. Mr. Abiy's rise to prominence in 2018 came during this growing resentment, dissolving the coalition and forming a new unity political party, the Prosperity Party. During this time, he also settled a long-term territorial dispute with Eritrea regarding Tigray's border, earning him the Nobel Peace Prize. However, these moves were met with suspicion by figures in Tigray. The TPLF had already refused to join the Prosperity Party and expressed concern at the new relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea. They instead hosted their own regional elections in September 2019 in open defiance to the central government. Among an escalation of rhetoric, the central government cut ties with Tigray's regional government, and by November, military action had started. The war has led to an explosion of simmering grievances between groups across Ethiopia, with historical animosity fostering into ethnic-based violence, especially between Tigray and its neighbouring regions of Amhara and Afar. Severe human rights abuses have been documented, including evidence of war crimes, such as ethnic cleansing. And while accurate figures are impossible to know, researchers at Ghent University this year estimated that the war in Tigray has claimed nearly 500,000 lives due to a combination of combat, starvation, and a lack of medical attention. But it's interesting that there exists this provisions at all in the country's constitution, because it's very irregular to have these provisions in any constitution for specific secession at all, and that's for me a fascinating aspect of the Ethiopian situation. Another aspect, of course, are, well, as you said, you mentioned about genocide. You mentioned about the whether or not it is genocide. There's certainly been claims of ethnic cleansing being mentioned across the country.
More than claims of, I think the most thorough documentation of a very serious incident has been done by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in Western Tigray, and a very, very substantive and well-documented allegations of ethnic cleansing, mainly against Amhara factions, of hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans in that area.
It's I've seen these reports as well, and it's certainly horrifying what is going on. What I was going to mention, of course, was the influence of the church in the country, who have also the leader of the Orthodox Church in Ethiopia has used the word genocide to refer to these things, but also the media itself. Well, I know you used to work for Bloomberg in Ethiopia, but the national medias are certainly fragmented and highly biased, especially along these national lines that we've been speaking about. So could you comment on some of these outside actors? I mean, the church and media are very separate things, but I do think it's interesting how these external forces are affecting the tensions within the country.
Yeah, I guess by external forces, you don't mean we don't mean forces external to Ethiopia, but forces outside of the conflict.
By that, yeah. I mean non-government, non-military actors. Yeah. That's what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so if we, with the media, like I'm probably better qualified to talk about. I think there's a couple of major sort of trends there. One is that the media generally is very weak relatively in Ethiopia. So the private press, in terms of sort of classic media institutions, the private press is pretty weak, including the online press. And there's been quite a sort of mushrooming of new online channels, but you don't have that really very strong established media institutions which are quite powerful and insulated from the threat of coercive action by the state. So I think that's a problem, and that sort of lends itself to being quite hard to establish facts in Ethiopia, to sort of feeds the polarization, because there's just constant dispute over what's actually happening. I think the other things are more related to fragmentation. So one, just because of the sort of technology and digital media explosion of online channels, social media activists, etc. So just a fragmenting of voice from the media, which a trend we see replicated elsewhere in the Ethiopian context, is sort of filling a bit of a vacuum in terms of strong traditional institutions. And then I think there's the sort of diversity, federalism component, where I think, as implied in your question, you have media which are linked to ethnic-based regional governments or otherwise ethnically identified or affiliated media, and they tend to have a rather ethnocentric approach to their coverage. I think that does lend itself towards bias and division, and that sort of dynamic is it is a product of this federal system. The idea of the federal system, one of the ideas, is to protect identities, to protect and promote identities. Now, I think in many contexts we would see that as a good thing, like the protection and promotion of the Welsh language is not a bad thing, right? Just to use an example. But ultimately that does lend itself to the sort of siloing effects writ large in Ethiopia, and a worrying increase in miscommunication, and sort of the creation of different narratives by the different communities, and that's something which also can very much be seen through the media. So those two problems of a weak media and a sort of fragmented media in a sort of ethno-political landscape, and that when you have obviously extreme violence and a civil war, then that all just gets accentuated. So there's been very little reporting from the Ethiopian media outside of Tigray on the suffering of Tigrayan civilians, for example, and quite a lot of support really for the war, a downplaying of atrocities against Tigrayans. And then, of course, the opponents of the TPLF and of Tigray's government would say that very little concern for the plight of civilians in Amhara region or Afar region who suffered at the hands of Tigray's forces and this type of thing. So it certainly hardens the differences and fuels the polarization. I think that the question of religion and the church is a difficult one. I mean, Tigray region and Amhara region, what is now, they are the sort of heartlands essentially of Orthodox Christianity in Ethiopia. That goes back millennia in terms of its role in society, and the state still plays a very prominent role despite Ethiopia being secular. Orthodox Christianity was a state religion until the revolution in 1974, but still very powerful cultural institution, and plenty of division and competition between Amhara and Tigray over sort of ownership, I guess, of the church. And again, that gets accentuated in a time of political division. So yes, we've seen the Tigrayan patriarch speak out about the atrocities in Tigray, call it a genocide, in a way which generally Amhara religious leaders have not. So yeah, we see the sort of factionalism and the political divisions breeding into the religious institutions, and then rather than playing a role of bringing Ethiopians together and providing a sort of common platform, a shared understanding to try and heal some of these divisions, instead they tend to make them worse.
We mentioned the state a couple of times so far in the conversation, but what is the government actually doing at the moment? I mean, outside of the military action, of course, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, his slogan for his election campaign a few years ago was coming together, Medema. And has this become quite the opposite for Ethiopia, not just in Tigray, but in general between the different groups? I mean, his party was supposedly a pan-ethnic party originally, without the Tigray representation, obviously. But what is the government doing in general?
In regard to the issue of sort of boosting national unity, or I mean, I think like the problem is that agenda that you sketched out and the sort of associated slogans and ideology from the PM and his allies, that just hasn't mapped out in reality. So yes, those sorts of aspirations were there, but then the prime minister is he's not a particularly straightforward political figure in terms of what he actually believes in. He can present himself as an Oromo nationalist, as someone who has full respect and has support for the multinational federation, and then he can talk about national unity in the next sentence. So there seems to be quite a lot of contradiction sort of built into his political approach, but and ultimately, I think the aspirations to boost national unity have not been successful, and I think that's just obvious by the fact that we have a region in open rebellion from the federal authorities, and we have this growing Oromo nationalist insurgency as perceptions of continued marginalization in that region, and a denial of autonomy and a fair share of federal power. Perceptions have grown in Oromia, so that shows you that whatever project the PM aspired to in terms of increasing harmony and unity has not been successful. And I think achieving those aims. That's not to say that the Prime Minister's agenda isn't without support, at various times, whether it's in Oromia region at the beginning or Amhara region at times, or in urban areas or in the diaspora. I mean, this agenda of greater unity obviously has support, but I think really to make material improvements there, certainly in terms of a program of constitutional reform, which enhances unity, reduces the salience of identity in Ethiopian politics and the state, that doesn't seem particularly imminent. We can imagine an attempt at constitutional reform in that regard, but it's not clear how the PM would bring on board some very significant political constituencies with that process, and so preclude the possibility of further violent rebellion. So at the moment, we have to see it as pretty much a stillborn project, and obviously there's a very strong argument that we've seen greater division and fragmentation of Ethiopia since he took the reins. That isn't to say it's all his fault by any means, but that is also an assessment I think we could reasonably make.
So beyond the purely national dynamics, what role can the international community play in resolving some of these tensions in Ethiopia? I mean, just yesterday, the United Nations announced that next year's Children in Armed Conflict report will include verified violations against children in Ethiopia, those violations being things such as abduction, sexual violence, attacks on schools and hospitals, and denial of aid. But is there a risk that the international community treats some of the underlying ethnic divisions within the country as a symptom of the war in Tigray and not as a cause, if that makes sense? What sort of policy actions are missing from these actors?
Well, I mean, this is I think myself and as we very see this as an Ethiopian political dispute at the heart of it. So there's only there's only a limited amount that external actors can do here. Obviously, governments and states are powerful actors, even when they're struggling at home and not that weak relatively in the international system. But people can't really force the Ethiopian government, and neither should they. And Ethiopians have to resolve their own political disputes, the types of things that we've been talking about. That said, obviously the international actors have a role in documenting and some of the abuses and just trying to make a fair assessment of who's done what. I think generally, the US and sort of allied international actors have been pushing for humanitarian access to Tigray, which has been denied by the federal government and its allies to a large degree. It seems like the right thing to do from all perspectives, pushing for ceasefire and political dialogue. There's been fairly, relatively united stance internationally from that. The problem is actually getting the Ethiopian actors, whether it's Tigray's leaders, Amhara, militia, Oromo nationalists, or the federal government, to take that path. I mean, the political disputes in Ethiopia have descended into violence, and the Ethiopian actors who are engaged in violence have to make the decision to go back to peaceful politics to try and sort out their problems. Above and beyond that, then we get to the sort of thorny issues of the classic issues of whether these international actors and donors should continue to fund the Ethiopian government and its operations or humanitarian development projects in Ethiopia in the context of a civil war and growing political violence, or should some of that financial assistance be used to try and should it be conditioned to sort of try and achieve political objectives? Very, very difficult stuff, and a sort of perennial debate that extends far beyond this current scenario in Ethiopia. And I think at Crisis Group, what we would like to see is that whilst there's a need to support 30 million Ethiopians who need emergency assistance at the moment, or is to ensure that there's no further sort of economic deterioration or economic collapse in the country, which would be devastating, obviously, and in no one's interest, really. Also, movements towards peace and genuine political dialogue, there should be incentives provided for that in the way that people formulate their assistance packages. We've seen a reduction in development assistance during the war. Now that we see some moves towards peace, people are ready to re-engage, donors are ready to re-engage, but that there really should be efforts to try and incentivize very kind of concrete achievements towards peace and more inclusive politics.
On that note, William, thank you for that intervention. I will wrap up the discussion here. Obviously, there are so many more elements we could talk about. The situation in Ethiopia is extremely complicated. Lots of historical grievances over many years, and there is plenty more that we can talk about here. But for now, I will say thank you for joining me today, and to all our listeners, please join us again for another episode of the MENA Talks podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks, and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.